So I think we are live, and I would like to welcome you in the room and those on the screen for today's event on how to address the food crisis without jeopardizing climate goals. And yeah, I think it's a very broad topic that has taken quite a bit of time in preparation on our end. So we wanted to be finished with the corresponding paper quite a bit earlier, but at least I was overwhelmed by the complexity of the topic. So we try now in 1 hour kind of dive a bit into what we have been doing and get essentially feedback, comments, and also insights from the policy side from 2 great panelists and commentators. What we are going to do is we'll first give Stefan von Kramon-Traubadel the floor to present in about 15 minutes some main direction of the paper that has been released today, so you can find it online. You, in parallel, if you're interested, can go to sly.do, so the website where you can type in questions for the Q&A session and comments that you have. And I'll then try to see how to make use of them in the panel discussion. And then we will have about 45 minutes to essentially discuss with the panelists 3 things. The first thing I would like to discuss whether how the panelists are assessing the current crisis, how big it is, where the most impacts are. The second element is what policy levers does the EU have, and are they well used at the moment, or could more be done, and where and what? And then finally, how these short-term imperatives of the crisis relate to the longer-term climate crisis. So I would be very interested also to hear from the panelists then their assessment on how the short-term imperatives and the longer-term climate policy objectives kind of are in competition or are essentially mutually dependent on each other. Now, I would like, as I said, to first give the floor to Stefan von Kramon-Traubadel. He is the chair for agricultural policy at the University of Göttingen for 20 years. And he has served in many functions in the International Association of Agricultural Economists, so he's a very well-known agricultural economist, not only in Germany, but beyond. And he combines academic work a lot on market integration in the agricultural markets with policy consulting, essentially with a global scope. So Stefan, I'm happy that you're here, and the floor is yours.
Great. Well, thank you very much for the kind introduction, and thank you for the invitation to contribute to this paper. I'm really looking forward to the presentation, and especially, of course, to the discussion afterwards with Andreas and David, who I know from other events and in other connections. I'm very much looking forward to their insights on this topic. The paper is quite comprehensive, and in 15 minutes, of course, I can really only touch on things briefly, but I'll do my best to give an overview of what we've put together here. I'll talk a little bit about Russia's war in Ukraine and its consequences. Then I'll start talking about some elements of a European policy response, a European policy mix. There's one sort of crisis-specific policy response that I see, and then there's a series of other policy levers that I'm going to touch on. And I call them here sort of ongoing debates, because these policy levers are all things that are actually already in discussion, sometimes for decades, but certainly heating up over the last decade. Essentially, Russia's attack on Ukraine has sort of heightened a number of important policy issues and policy conflicts that we have to somehow find a way to solve. And then at the end, some concluding thoughts. First of all, Russia's aggression and its consequences. A picture is worth 1,000 words, and the thing is, there's thousands of pictures like this. In the 1990s and through to about 2006, I was quite active in Ukraine in a policy advisory group, and I've supervised a number of Ukrainian PhD students and so on, and so I have a lot of strong ties to the country, and I get pictures like this sent every now and then, and the brothers and sisters of former students have died in this conflict. This is just an example of what's happening in actual agriculture and the production side of agriculture, and you've probably seen lots of pictures like this. It's not just, of course, the pure production side, it's all the infrastructure, it's storage, it's the grain export infrastructure, it's the harbors. All of these things have been affected by the war. What does that mean for production and for exports? I'm going to focus just on the exports here. And this shows you over the last basically 11 years what Ukraine has exported: wheat, coarse grains, and maize or corn. You see the increasing trend as the country's agriculture has increasingly developed. And you can see here, first of all, I'm not sure if the pointer is working. Yes, it does. Okay, it doesn't work on the screen though. But you can see in the second to last column, you can see that we were expecting back in January or early February of this year, we were expecting Ukraine to export about 64 million tons of grain. In the end, it has exported less, about 12 million tons less, because of the various effects of the war on exports. But the really big effect is being felt this year. In the last column, you see what we expect Ukraine will export now, and you see it's well below trend. If we had gone just by trend, we would expect about 30 million tons more of exports than we're going to get. And this year has been a particularly good year in the region in terms of climate and so on. The Russians are going to bring in a record wheat harvest of probably about 100 million tons. Last year, Russia harvested maybe 75 million tons. So this is a huge harvest, and presumably if Ukraine had not been affected by the war, it would also have benefited from the overall good conditions in the region and probably would have exported above trend as well. What this means is that in a fairly short period of time, world markets have had to adapt to the idea that there's going to be maybe at least 41, 42 million tons of grain less available than had been anticipated. If it was just last year shortfalls, it wouldn't be so bad. But this year, the 30 million tons that are missing there, that's maybe 7% of global exports, and that is something that markets have to adapt to. As a result, more or less the moment the war began, prices exploded. As you can see here, the prices have come down somewhat since, so there's been some relief, and I'll touch on that later on. It's not just that the price levels have increased, but here also is just a quick look at the day-to-day price changes, the volatility. And you can see how that's increased a lot as well, right? And that is for a trader, that is for a government official who's responsible for imports, for purchases, for example. That's for something like the World Food Program. That's a huge headache. Right. I was even reading in a market report a few weeks ago a sort of sarcastic remark saying that even the speculators aren't having any fun anymore because this is worse than a lottery. Right. What we also should remember, though, and that's why this crisis is having such far-reaching impacts, is that prices and world markets were already increasing. The world market situation was already quite tight leading into this situation. Largely as a result of Corona, but due to several other factors as well, we see that prices had already increased quite substantially since the beginning of 2020, sorry. And so the basis from which these Russian war, Ukraine effects started out was already quite high. As a result of all of this, you've seen pictures like this before, graphs like this, right? The number of hungry worldwide has been increasing already since 2017 or 2018. We were already losing ground, and basically the situation now in Ukraine is sort of, it's oil on a fire that was already starting to burn. Food insecurity, well, the operating costs for the World Food Program, which has to buy grain on the market in order to be able to provide assistance, has increased. The last estimate that I saw was 74 million per month compared with before the crisis. The UN estimates all around that funding requirements as a result of COVID and the situation in Ukraine now have gone to almost 38 billion, and we have a huge funding gap there. Promises made but money not yet delivered, which is really, really disconcerting. And I'd like to remind us all that food insecurity has become an issue in Ukraine, of course, as well, which is sort of one of the last places on this planet where you would expect that to be the case. But there are so many internally displaced people in the country, and so many people need humanitarian aid now in Ukraine. And starting, 6 or 7 weeks ago, Russia has been, in a downright criminal manner attacking civilian infrastructure, and that means that people are going to have to spend a cold winter without heating and electricity to some extent. And food security is not just a question of having the physical access to the food, it's also being able to store food, prepare food. It's also being in a healthy condition so that you can assimilate food properly, and all of these things are affected by the crisis in Ukraine as well. Now, what about policy responses? First of all, there's a very crisis-specific response has to do with making sure that Ukraine can export as much as possible. Right. The Black Sea corridor has, as you've all heard about this, I'm sure, on the news, it's worked better than expected. I remember talking to traders at the end of July and hearing them say that they would expect that maybe 2 million tons per month could go by the sea route out of Odessa and the other 2 harbors in that region. But I think we're well over 3 million tons per month now. And so that has provided some relief, and that brings me back to that price decrease that we've seen since. The other thing is that just generally around the world, the harvests this year in most of the important producing regions of the world were good, or at least solid. We didn't have any major negative surprises elsewhere. So the Black Sea corridor has helped a lot, but it's vulnerable. It is basically operates at the whim of the Russian dictator, essentially, and so we need the land route as well. And it's sort of funny for an agricultural economist because, under normal conditions, we would never think about exporting Ukrainian grain via the land route. It just doesn't make any sense. But we need it now. We need it to make sure that we can get back to somewhere near the 5 to 6 million tons per month of exports that Ukraine can handle. And we also need it as an insurance policy, basically, because we have to worry that Russia is going to continue to use the corridor as a lever, as a policy tool, as a weapon, essentially. Right. And I mean, all we need is for one ship to get sunk in the coming weeks, and it could happen. It could happen by accident because there's mines floating around in the Black Sea, or it could happen on purpose. But markets would go haywire, of course. There's a number of issues associated with the land route. I won't go into any details here. It has worked reasonably well, but there have been some important problems, and that's something where the EU could certainly help. It's important for grain markets globally. We need the Ukrainian supply as much as possible. It's also very important for the Ukrainian farmers, because at the moment, if you can get maybe $300 or $320 a ton on world markets, a Ukrainian farmer is happy if he or she can get $140 a ton. The costs of the transport are so much higher, insurance and other questions are such a burden, and that means that Ukrainian farmers are basically taking in, at very best, production costs generally less, and they have very little incentive, and they don't have the liquidity to plant next year's crop. And they desperately need to do that. There's estimates that they're going to be planting maybe 30 to 35% less area next year than this year. And that means, in a sense, that the crisis might propagate into the next year and might even turn out to be stronger, in a sense, if Ukrainian production goes down strongly and if we maybe next year don't have good production everywhere else in the world. It's a very sensitive situation. Going on to other policy levers, well, first of all, increasing production in the EU, of course, has been something that's been discussed. There's been discussion about whether or not we should maybe start taking some land that is currently fallow and using it again, or maybe not increasing the fallow requirements as foreseen. That's a complex issue. There's some trade-offs involved. Fallow land is generally, of course, not the best land, so it's not going to produce a lot more, and there are negative environmental costs involved. In the farm-to-fork strategy, there are reductions on pesticide use and fertilizer use planned. Those would, of course, reduce production in the EU, and the question is that something that we should be doing at this time under these global market conditions? There's also plans to increase organic agriculture to 25% of area by 2030. That's also something that would reduce production in the EU. The environmental benefits are clear, but if we reduce production and global demand stays the same or continues to increase, that means more has to be produced elsewhere. And that could mean that we are largely shifting environmental burdens, but not necessarily reducing them globally. Shifting production of food, reducing competition with non-food uses. These are, of course, food fuel and food feed debates are long ongoing debates, very important debates where we have to find solutions. I won't go into details here, but clearly there are issues involved. If we are on a global scale feeding about 40% of the grain that's produced to livestock and not to people, and we know that in many parts of the world, including our own, people are eating more livestock products than they really need to be well fed, and that is good for them from a health perspective. Finally, and I think this is actually more important than thinking about reducing our production, it's reducing our consumption. Right? If we consume less meat, then somewhere on this planet less meat has to be produced. Whether it's here or elsewhere isn't necessarily so important, perhaps, but we have to find ways to reduce our consumption, and we have to find ways to reduce food waste. Improving the allocation of given production is important, so here come all the issues associated with development aid, humanitarian aid. There is a number of tables in the paper that list countries that are heavily import dependent on Russian and Ukrainian grain, list a number of countries, especially low-income countries, that spend more than 10% of their total export earnings on grain imports. In other words, they're highly vulnerable. These countries need assistance, and we have to find ways of ramping that up quickly. But at the same time, in a more medium-term and long-term perspective, the import dependency of these countries can be, not all of them, but many of them can be reduced by closing yield gaps and by reducing their dependency by increasing their own ability to produce. Strengthening global market integration, I think, is an important point here as well. We have to resist protectionist urges. You've certainly heard, I'm sure, about countries that responded to the increasing prices with export bans. That is, of course, dangerous. That's essentially you don't export your grain anymore, but instead you export hunger, to put a very dull point on it. But it's not just exporting countries. I have a graph here where I want to show you quickly. These are global wheat prices over the last roughly 5 years. And you see the peak here caused by by Russia's aggression in Ukraine. And what I've done here is I've gone to the FAO and I've picked out prices, domestic prices from 3 countries, and not just any 3 countries, India, China, and Indonesia. Together they have over 3 billion population. And I'm not sure that these prices are representative. This is what I can find on the FAO. But if you look here, this is a wholesale price for wheat in India, an average flour retail price in Indonesia, and a wholesale price for wheat in China. And what you basically see is that they have largely shielded their domestic populations from these price developments. Right? When prices go up, when markets are tight, the basic message is we have to tighten our belts. The more countries out there say, well, we're not going to tighten our belts, the more the remaining countries have to tighten their belts. The tighter they have to bring them. It's as simple as that. Right? And if we had a more better functioning integrated global market system, then the effects of the shortfall in Ukraine would be spread over far more people and shoulders, and we would have less sharp effects, because the really peaking price that you see here in red, some countries, the poorest of the poor, they can't afford to avoid that in any way. They're left holding the bag. So to conclude, Russia's war in Ukraine heightens existing and growing global tensions between productivity requirements on the one hand. The population of the world is growing. People want to eat more in many countries. We have to find ways of increasing productivity, but at the same time, we also have, of course, a number of important concerns about sustainability. And the war sort of just heightens or increases the tensions in that area. In the paper, we come to 3 sort of very general conclusions that I repeat here. The solutions are going to come from a number of different policy areas. It's not just agriculture policy, it's energy policy, it's infrastructure, development and aid, etc. Individual solutions are important, but what we really need is a mix. They have to be combined to be effective. right? And most of the solutions involve trade-offs. At least in the short run, there's some fairly some fairly sharp or tricky trade-offs involved. We have to embrace complexity. There's no easy fixes here. Of course, and I think this bears repetition, and it's my last word, only a sustainable agriculture can guarantee food security in the long run. In other words, this crisis cannot be taken as sort of an excuse for going back to business as usual, or let's abandon our sustainability agenda. But it does make us realize that the sustainability agenda has an important productivity and food security component as well. And with that, I'm finished. Thank you very much.
Many thanks, Stefan. That was really fantastic, and I think both pedagogic and comprehensive. I think before asking you some question, I would like to give the floor to David Laborde-Lebuquet, and he is currently joining us from Seattle at I think 4 in the morning. So thanks a lot for making time to join us. We're really grateful for that. David is working at the International Food Policy Research Institute in Washington, so probably the most renowned agricultural research center globally. He works largely on the part that Stefan described last, so globalization, international trade. He does modeling, but also policy, has a history at CEPI before. And I would like you to maybe give a bit of view first on your assessment of the size and distribution of the current crisis for 5 minutes or so, and then in the next round we will go to the policy side of it. David?
Yes, thank you for the invitation. Also, thank you for the policy brief. And I would say the presentation that we have just seen that actually provide a very good overview of what is going on and what can be done. So our assessment is very similar to what have been just discussed. I maybe just raise 2 additional points is due to the economic consequence of COVID, I think that we also had a large share of the population, in some cases, both in low-income country, middle-income country, and advanced economy, that were pretty vulnerable economically to a new shock. So, it's not like if the price of food increased in a situation where income were high and purchasing power were high overall. No, we really had to deal with this food crisis in a situation where the economic situation were tense. The second point I want to make is we had actually a combination of crises that has led to the rising price on the end before the invasion, but also the overall rising of food insecurity, because in addition of COVID, we had a situation coming from the climate situation and the weather in particular last year that were pretty adverse to some other breadbasket. I mean, in 2021, the drought in Canada and the US has basically removed from the market for the first semester of this year 10 million tons of wheat. So it's 6 times more than what was missing from Ukraine in the first semester. So, we had this combination of shock that have created very tight condition, but also I think that we should not forget what it means for the long run, and that's what I think your dialogue today is so important, because climate change is a threat that is here, that's not going to disappear, and on which we need to tackle it seriously, I would say, both from a mitigation and adaptation angle. And at the same time, we also had the third C, if you want. We had COVID, we have climate, it's also conflict. Of course, with Ukraine, we have an example of high-level conflict that has global consequence, and of course, regional ones, and very dire local ones for Ukraine and its population. But we have other hotspots of conflict. Think about Yemen, what has happened in northern Ethiopia, I can go on, that have created also a high level of food insecurity And when you combine all of that, actually you have today 5 countries that are near to a famine situation. So that's really what I think has created a very particular dangerous landscape this year. And I think that as we will discuss during the coming hour, is beyond what's happened on the virtual markets, it's what's happened on the energy markets that both in order to transport food, process food, you need energy, but also the link between natural gas and the fertilizer market, that is going to lead to additional production costs for some farmers and reduced yield in a different part of the world. So just for letting time for more discussion, that I will stop here on this assessment of the situation, and we are happy to iterate in a new round of elements.
Can I maybe ask one question back on international trade of agricultural products in the crisis? Do you think we so far managed relatively well to keep markets open, or do you think we are essentially on a risky, slippery slope towards even more protectionism?
So I think things could have been worse. As we know, with every crisis, we start to see selfish response by government, in particular in terms of export restriction. And as it has been very clear also in the previous presentation, we have countries that also try to maintain high level of import to stabilize their domestic prices. So you see both, countries that want to buy more, or to buy at any price, and so it means that you have policy intervention at some level to do that, and you have some countries that limit export. Between, in particular, March and June, we have seen this peak of export restriction. Since then, to some level, they have largely decreased. Earlier this year, the wheat market was restricted. Palm oil also from Indonesia was heavily restricted, with a number of consequences for other importing countries, but at the end also for the small farmers in both India on the wheat sector and on palm oil in Indonesia have been damaged by these policies. So at one point, it was about 17% of the world trade of calories that were restricted. So clearly, it's not great. And that's something that in every crisis we see, and we really try to get more cooperation. I think this year also the WTO, in June, countries, after more than a decade of discussion on that, decided to not put export restriction on humanitarian shipments like WFP, but that's still a relatively small amount of what is traded internationally. Even for a country like Yemen, that is a very vulnerable one, half of the import are still done commercially. So, for them saying, oh, WFP will not be targeted, but some of the shipment that Yemen has bought in India were blocked. That's not a great news. So I will say we can do much more on that. It's just right now, we just have a number of countries, and in many cases, always the usual suspect that continue to use this tool, but we have not seen, the same magnitude of restriction that we may have seen even in the 70s or the 80s. So, always depend what is your coverage on that.
Thanks, David. Let me turn to Andreas Schneider. Andreas Schneider is a member of the cabinet of the Commissioner for Agriculture, and he has essentially he combines both practical experience in agriculture as well as think tank experience in Brussels and academic experience, has a PhD in agricultural economics. And so what is the assessment from the Commission side on the current amplitude of the crisis and the need for action?
Is it working? Yes. Thanks firstly for the invitation. I welcome this forum because I think it's very important that policymakers and think tanks work together, and I think we should do that more so. First, I would just one thing on the definition. Personally, I don't like the word food insecurity. I rather have food security, because you can either be secure or not secure. But insecurity, it's whenever I have some input in the Commission, I always make sure that we only talk about food security, and then you can do it either way. I think the paper is very good. It's very balanced. That is very important, I think. I vividly remember when in March, after the invasion, we had our first crisis meeting, if you like, because in the end of March, I can't remember the exact date, our first communication came out on the subject. And but for me, it was very clear we are talking about here about an international food security crisis, because the Commission tried to focus in the first instance only on European, and maybe the gist out of the first paper, you can say, okay, we are safe. It is not a question for Europe on food security, but it's a question of food affordability. And that is, I think, the first line. But we evolved very quickly to see that it has a huge knock-on effect on the rest, because we all remember maybe 2008, the Arab Spring, and the knock-on started with the hunger crisis, and the knock-on effect is, that we have almost a complete destruction of Syria. So we were all warned about it, and it also showed to us how important Ukraine is. I mean, not only on wheat, but on sunflower oils and on some essential nuts. So people were flabbergasted to see, hey, what are they actually producing? And in particular, I think it was the MENA countries, Sub-Saharan Africa and MENA, also Middle East and North African countries. They were very much impacted. And our first response was, we have to get the stuff out. And as Stefan was saying, it was 35 million tons were missing. And that is not even counted the 50 million which normally come on the market from Russia. So we had a huge deficit, and we had to do something to do that. And one of the first responses was the solidarity lanes, because it was clear to us what we have to do is we have to empty the silos, because if the silos are full, the new harvest cannot go into the silos. So we had to find quick solutions, and one of the first one was, as I said, the solidarity lanes. But obviously, with a lorry or with a train, you can't ship as much as you can with a boat, with a ship. And the Black Sea grain agreement only came into force, I think, in August. So it took a while, but we are good now, because we have now 19 million ton left Ukraine since May, so that's pretty good. And I just had to open it up again. I always forget it, because you asked David about the exports. The European Union exported 80%. We increased our export 80% to Sub-Saharan Africa and 40% to the MENA countries. So that's quite a lot. And it is 48% of our export went to Sub-Saharan Africa and 34% to the MENA regions. So, I mean, that showed that the initial response, which was defined over the years, worked to some extent. And what else did we do? Because it was clear, the 35 million tons, we have to compensate somewhat. What can Europe do? And I come to that maybe in the second round, what we did, because Stefan mentioned the fallow land. We have to do something, and to support our farmers. So we came up with this 500 million in the crisis reserve, which is a normal procedure to some extent, and more importantly, that we softened the temporary framework for state aid. That was important. I understand, not every country has the same financial means, to support the industries or the farmers, but at least it was showing a sign we have to do something. And that was one thing, because the other things, for instance, the relaxation of the fallow land for this year, it was quite easy, because we still have the old CAP reform, so it was easier to manage. But from next year onwards, the 1st of January, the new CAP will kick in. We could use one derogation, which we did, but this internally in the Commission was already not easy. Because then, as Stefan was saying, here you have internal conflicts. We know we have to produce more, but at what cost? And we thought it's good to relax this, so we gave basically the member states the option to either, derogate from it or to leave it. And I have to say that almost all 27 member states actually took on the derogation, but we cannot do that for 24. I mean, if you want to do it for 24, we have to change the regulation. So here, we have to see how we play it, and obviously we still have a little bit of time because we have to see what next year brings. But again, it wasn't an easy call, and even in the college, because the commissioners have to come together and decide, it wasn't an easy go. But in the end, I think, I shouldn't say maybe common sense, but it prevailed that we say we have to produce. It's clear. And what was also clear was our role in providing, not only for us, but for the rest of the world as well. And the figures I just mentioned showed, that we do take this seriously. And if I, go a step further, because in October, we came forward with this communication on fertilizer. And although we were saying that food security is maybe not so acute here, more affordability, but if we don't get the fertilizer, then that could maybe turn into food security even here. So, with the communication, by and large, we can't do much. We can only support the producers of fertilizer by some state aid or other means to produce. But here is, especially for the nitrogen fertilizer, the problem is the price of gas. If the price of gas comes down, we can produce. But here we also are faced with difficult choices because we have some international operators, fertilizer operators, and what they do, they produce outside the fertilizer cheaply, bring the ammonium here into Europe and convert it into urea, to bring out. And we don't want, that they benefit from, the windfall, they benefit from the subsidies, and then produce it somewhere else. But it is also important to underline that we have to have fertilizer industry here. And I think that is the overriding effect. We support them, that they stay here, especially smaller ones. We cannot afford, with the COVID and the Ukraine crisis, I think what is clear is we need more reliable supply chains. And by having this, it means we have to produce whatever we can locally, maybe at a higher price, but we have to do that. Because here when you look at the paper, which is very good in the end, when you have all these, the tables, point 2 is maintaining fertilizer use. Of course we have to do this. And Stefan also mentioned the pesticide regulation. The pesticide regulation, the Commission wanted to bring it forward on the 23rd of March. It was the same day when we came forward with the first communication. So we said, hey, you can't do this. It's very contradicting. But the Commission President, Ursula von der Leyen, at the time, she promised to bring this communication or the regulation forward before the summer. So it came then in June. But it's conflicting. So, we have to see how we get out of it. And in a way, it's turned out now that I think the council, they will not block it, but they will push it into the long grass, so that it dies maybe the slow death, so basically it will not be dealt with until the end of this commission. Because for them it's clear we want to produce food. That is what we want to do.
Yeah. Thanks a lot, Andreas. I think you moved already into the policy field, which I think is what we wanted to do. I would like first to give the floor to David and then to you, Stefan. What is your take on the role of European policy in addressing the food crisis? So, do you think Europe has a specific role to play in terms of increasing production, or just for the trade kind of liberalization agenda? Or do you think in the end, it's a global market? Maybe the question is a bit oversimplified, but kind of get me your sense of what is the role of EU policy making in addressing the food crisis?
Yes, no, just by sheer size, what happened in Europe has regional and global consequences. As discussed just before, yes, at the beginning of the year, actually some European countries were able to export more wheat, in particular to some MENA or certain African countries. It has been part of a global rebalancing. Also, in terms of magnitude, the Latin America has done much more of the rebalancing. So, we really want, I think, globally to make sure that we maintain diversified pole of production And the last thing we would like to get from a food security perspective is that European production, in some cases heavily supported European production, start displace the supply response we would like to see coming from some African countries, for instance. So Europe has to contribute to global market and maintain open trade. But Europe is not here to just feed the world at any cost, both environmentally and economically. So that's where we just need to find here the right balance. And I think so far that's what we have seen. But I mean, in any crisis, we see specific lobbies that say, we have the solution, we are going to take care of it. And we just, hopefully, we have to be more careful. I mean, also within EU, we have seen, various countries having, different opinions. Some even have started to say, okay, maybe within even EU, we want to keep an eye on what we do with our own grains. And so, maintaining the single markets in all the crises, I mean, that we have seen it in even 2011 and 12, we have seen it during COVID, that we have internally in Europe, happily an integrated market that helps stabilizing things. But in every crisis, you see some policymaker that may want to rediscuss this. And but also we have to acknowledge that this year in Europe we had severe droughts also that have, if I think about the case of Hungary, slash the maize production, and so Europe has to import more maize. And including, maize that traditionally leave Ukraine to go to other parts of the world, in other middle-income countries in particular, Europe was in need of it. So that's where, in terms, of medium-term response, what it means for the livestock industry in Europe, that's going to be important. So yes, during the core crisis, finding the right mix between protecting some producer in Europe, obviously also protecting some consumer in Europe, that at the end, this social safety net is mainly a member state responsibility, but still, I mean, that we also need some coordination on that is going to be pretty important. And then I think really that the development pillar for Europe that is going to be important in terms of public policy. Europe is a key player in global food security, but also in agricultural development. I think it has to continue and even to accelerate, especially to avoid, this narrative where Europe is going to feed the world. No, that's not what we want, and what we need, in particular in a more stochastic system where we need more people to be able to participate to the global food trade. And let's be honest, what the situation in Ukraine means that in some case, development money is going to be relocated to Ukraine first or Ukraine refugees. And we are going to see a very difficult trade-off from a fiscal point of view, but also about, who needs help. So that, I think, will be the more ambitious part of the European response. And last but not least is, yes, we have to put sanctions on Russia. For other reason, also, Europe has put sanctions on Belarus. But in the case of the situation of Belarus and the fact that Belarus is still a key player on the potash market, there is here also a very complex diplomatic situation. But Europeans should not forget about how some of these policies in this field may impact third parties at different degree. And it will need to adjust some policies, especially if we enter in a new long-term relation with some of the countries like Belarus and Russia.
Thanks, David. Stefan, you want to react? So,
if I may, I pick up on sorry. Oh, there we are. If I may, I pick up on 2 points that have been brought up, which I find really important and interesting. David, I didn't really talk a lot about fertilizer markets, and you're very right to emphasize that, and that brings the link to energy. And that's going to be a huge part of how this unfolds, because the standard economic response to high prices to say that the best cure for high prices are high prices, because they provide incentives for increased production. But since we have at the same time these problems on fertilizer markets, the shortages and the high prices, that's going to dampen the supply response that we might usually see. I think in past food crises, 2007, 2008, it's often been the case that we sort of underestimate the supply response. We underestimate how clever and how quick farmers will react, provided the incentives. But with fertilizer prices where they are, and when we look at the global distribution of fertilizer and how it's being affected by the crisis, that fertilizer use will go down precisely in some middle and low income countries where the marginal benefits of an additional kilogram of fertilizer are particularly high. I really worry that that's going to maybe dampen the supply response, and that will make it more difficult for us to get out of this. You have to distinguish, I guess, though, between, on the one hand, the nitrogen, which is energy-based, and when I talk to people in the trade, they tell me that, of course, in other countries, in the Gulf, for example, the Gulf states and so on, are investing like crazy at the moment in production capacity. And they're sort of predicting sort of a pork cycle effect where a few years down the road, we're going to have very low prices for some of these things. I don't know. But the other, phosphorus and potassium, of course, if Russia and Belarus are responsible for a large part of global supply and they simply aren't supplying, then we really have a problem there. The other big point I wanted to pick up on is the last one from David, the role of the EU. I think it's very, very important. And getting back to some of the sustainability issues, if we are really going to go to some sort of carbon pricing in agriculture, which we need in the long run to bring these things together, individual EU member states can't do that. If anybody has some weight in the international discussion, it is the EU as an actor in Geneva at the WTO or wherever else. And I've been worried in the last years looking at the evolution of European agriculture policy because I see some of these sort of disintegration tendencies. I see that the recoupling of direct payments is creeping upwards as time goes by. And speaking specifically as someone who's active in Germany, in Germany, you've maybe heard of this outside, we had the so-called Borchert-Kommission that developed more detailed plans for increasing animal welfare in Germany. And we had the Zukunftskommission Landwirtschaft, which developed a plan for how to make German agriculture more sustainable. And all of these national initiatives, although I find them very, I understand the motivation and what they're trying to do is important, but they seem to somehow ignore the fact that we're part of an EU common market. And if I increase the standards for pork production in Germany, but I have open markets to Spain and Poland and other countries that produce lots of pigs, I get into difficulties. And so the German government starts talking about how we can maybe somehow introduce special subsidies for German producers, and things like that really worry me because that's undermining the common market in the long run. Other countries will want to use those derogations for other purposes, and they might not be as noble as increasing animal welfare. I think we really have to focus on Brussels, making compromises here in Brussels, because that's where we have the international voice and the international weight, also in response to crises like we have now with Russia's attack on Ukraine.
Yeah, thanks, Stefan. We could talk for hours. You're opening up a completely new field about member states versus Brussels and the disintegration of the internal market, which I think we should also find more place and more time to discuss these things. One thing when we worked on the paper was that I had the feeling that there is more space in Brussels for having such discussions in a more neutral setting. I have a question to you, Andreas, and kind of for opening the last round before the Q&A. Now we have this short-term crisis, and we see all the overlaps with the sustainability agenda on fertilizer production and CO2 emissions and the other elements that Stefan mentioned. And your focus in what you explained was quite strongly on ensuring food security. So do you see some sort of trade-off between the kind of long-term Green Deal goals and the food security agenda, or will the focus shift in the coming time, and how to essentially accommodate the two policy goals?
Yeah, it's probably one of the key questions here. I mean, in the communication in March, that we have short-term and long-term things, and the Commissioner made it very clear also that nobody is actually doubting the Green Deal targets. You know, although they maybe have to step back now for 1 or 2 years, but I think in the long run, this is what we want to do. But how did we get there? You know, and Stefan, in a way, he mentioned it. From next year onwards, I mentioned it before, you know, the new CAP will come into force. And with it is the eco-schemes. And I have to say, I'm very disappointed with some of the eco-schemes presented by the member states. You know, we have approved now almost all plans, one is missing. For instance, only 6 member states do on precision farming. Only a few do something on animal welfare. Only a few do something on carbon farming. You know, so here we have to, from next year onwards, when they are, we want to monitor it in order to push the member states, you know, in order that they change it. And the regulation also says that you can 8 times you can change in those remaining 5 years. You can change those national strategic plans, and that's what we want to do. We want to keep an eye on it, that we not losing out on the long-term goals, but obviously we have to you know, make sure that we have enough food, you know, on the table, and also I think what we are trying to maybe balance a little bit. I mean, we have a lot of levers now on sustainability, but we have to also make sure that the farms remain viable, because only if a farmer can live off the land, you know, he can invest in the future. So here, I'm not saying it's a trade-off, but we have to put it into perspective. And I personally, I'm a very strong advocate for precision farming. I mean, 50%, Stefan maybe can correct me, 50% in Ukraine are under satellite. Here in Europe, we're way below 10. And I think, why? I mean, one thing is probably we have a problem with broadband, but the other thing is we have to support the introduction of digital technologies. And, you know, I praise it for the last, I don't know, 5, 6, 7 years, and we're not getting any further. And I'm not saying we should do it for the big farms, we should do it terrestrial, on the whole lot, the small ones and the big ones. Because if in most cases, digital precision farming only works if you have the underlying soil map inside. But if that is a connection, you know, you save fertilizer, you know, you save the application, and you know exactly on this square meter you need a little bit more magnesium or whatever it is. This is one of the things we should really push. And we know roughly, you know, that you have, if you have precision farming, you have at least 50% resource protection with it. So there is a lot of scope, you know, we can do. And answering the question, that goes hand in hand. You know, you still produce, but you still do something on the sustainability way.
Thanks, Andreas. I think I would also throw this question to David, and then on top give you one of the questions that I got from Slido. You still can put your questions there. So I think the hashtag on Slido is hunger. The question I would pick for David is on speculation. So one of the participants in the poll asked essentially what can we do against speculation, but maybe rephrasing the question slightly: is there a big problem currently with food speculation that is amplifying the current crisis, and how should we read it? I think you have heard this question before. David?
Yes. So I think that the overall issue of speculation is, you know, overblown. In the middle of a crisis, you try to find people to blame and to find some people that profit from the crisis. We have seen it in 2007-8, in 2011-12. Actually, some regulation have been put on some of the pure market since then. But I would say that the very vast majority of research that has been done on the topic show that speculation is a very limited factor. That, of course, when you have very volatile market,
He froze.
Then maybe I give the question.
We have not seen, you know, I was frozen. I'm not frozen anymore.
But now you're back.
Sorry. So I'm not sure what you have heard. What I was saying is speculation overall is a very limited issue globally and on key markets that actually, even in Europe, you have a regulatory agency that keep an eye on what's going on. When prices were high, most traders were trying to sell, not to hold or to keep a position. As you have seen on the graph that we are showing, you have a bad news, price go up, but prices have actually decreased on this future market pretty fast. If you look at the distribution in the future of the future contract, people were expecting price to decrease. So there is a bit of not evidence-based discussion on speculation. Now, on specific markets, actually, and including in some developing countries, we have seen speculation where you actually lack competition. You had some importers that have created local scarcity or actually increased their prices very fast when they were going up and did not decrease them when they were going down. But I really think that on that question of speculation, we have other drivers, we have other problems to deal with than a speculation right now. And the bulk of the economic research that has been done on this topic draw the same conclusion.
I think, Stefan, you would agree to that?
Yeah, and actually, I'm looking over towards the Régie. If it's possible to bring up my slides one more time, I'm not sure if it is. I have one slide I'd like to show here at the end. I have to flip. Here we are. Okay. This is the current December wheat contract on the Matif market in Paris, the futures contract, and this is where the speculation along with hedging and other things take place. And I showed you before how the volatility has increased on the market. We're getting price swings, day-to-day price swings in the last months that we never saw before, much bigger. And those price swings are, of course, an opportunity to make a lot of money if you get it right. Now, who's going to get it right? Maybe people who have some special information? I picked out 3 episodes for you here. This episode here is the price on June 3rd and then next Monday, and you see it's jumped a lot. What happened on the weekend? Well, Russia bombed the second largest grain terminal in Mykolaiv, and that, of course, sent the markets all worried. Well, who knew that that bombing was going to take place? Here we have an episode. This is at the beginning of October. Maybe you remember that Putin was in Vladivostok and held a speech. Among other things, he said that the Russians were disappointed by the functioning of the Black Sea grain corridor. And so Russia was going to reconsider and perhaps close the corridor. Before the speech, we were at 345. By Monday, the speech came on the weekend. By Monday, when the markets opened, they jumped up to, that's a $20 jump, that's a lot, 20 euros, that's a lot of money on these markets. And the last one is the jump back and forth that maybe you remember at the end of October. Russia said it was going to close the grain corridor. Before that, the markets were at 337. After the announcement was made, they jumped up to 358. But the next day, Russia said, we're backing down, we're going to reopen it after all, and the markets jumped down to 341. Now, if I'm Vladimir Putin, I've got some money on a bank account in Cyprus that's dealt through a bank account on the Cayman Islands that goes throughout 18 corners, and I can turn a little bit of money into a huge profit with this insider information. I'm just speculating. There's no way we can ever prove this, but I'm not worried about speculation. I'm worried about insider trading on the parts of some people who are actively manipulating world markets at the moment.
And then to wrap up, there was a last question to you from Connor, who mentioned that you said kind of meat production in Europe or meat consumption has to go down in order to make more food globally available. Mm-hmm. And he was wondering about kind of time scales in terms of agility of the rebalancing of the global food system. So how quickly is typically the global food rebalancing towards individual shocks? Is it within 1 year, or how long does it take?
Yeah. There are some lags involved, of course, because what we're feeding to the animals is not one-to-one things that we can feed to people. So it means that we have, large areas of land that are being used to produce primarily feed-grade grains, for example, or oil seeds, and that by shifting land in this way, we certainly could. But it's something that's going to take a bit of time.
And then, I wanted to turn you with my last question, and then I would close, and also if you want to say something in addition to that. But kind of in the crisis, have you felt that kind of the knowledge infrastructure on agriculture that is available to you is sufficient to kind of make good policy in the face of such an extreme situation, or would you see that there is room for improvement on the European side?
I mean, room for improvement, hang on. Yeah, room for improvement is always given. I mean, could you please put up the last slide again, just quickly? Not from the questions here, I just wonder, the questions you were just heading, because I wanted to talk about this one here. Firstly, as maybe as an improvement for this, maybe we should look at the drivers of food security. The Commission will come forward with a paper on it, and there are all sorts of things, the environmental standards and so forth. But if we wouldn't have Ukraine, we wouldn't be sitting here and talking about food security. So I think conflict, and I think all the drivers have to be ranked, and just as a throw-in. But this one here came up very obviously, the meat production, the consumption, and what happened. But we have to understand that 75% of the agriculture area in the world is either grassland or forest. So, and here in Europe, we have the case, that if the permanent grassland, it cannot be plowed. So it has to remain permanent grassland. So the question is, what do you do? And there are some quarters, they would like to get rid of all the livestock production in Europe, but we wouldn't do the animal a favor. They probably would come then from Serbia or maybe from Ukraine and so forth, because the consumption maybe will go down too, but not to the same extent. So we have to ask ourselves, what we want. And the grassland, which is not being managed by some extent, will not capture any CO2. I mean, that's clear, because by growing and you managing it, you can capture more. So it's a very difficult question, but the question is used by many, I would say, more on the left side of the house, by saying, look, this is the opportunity finally to reduce the livestock production, the methane output. But here we have other solutions too. What did I?
No, I think. Okay.
Good. I think we reached the hour. There are still questions open on Slido, probably with you, also with me. I think what what the paper showed, I think what this event reinforced is the complexity of agricultural policy questions, that it's not only agricultural policy, also energy policy, foreign policy, trade policy involved, that there is a need for complex strategic thinking about those questions, that we should not entirely leave it to the agricultural sector alone to think about it, but we also should not kind of be solely focused on individual purposes like food security alone or the climate agenda alone. So it remains a very complex area. And I highlighted that before, my main takeaway from essentially our first exercise in agricultural economics at Bruegel for 10 or 15 years is the learning curve is extremely steep and it's very complex, and I would hope to see also more people in Brussels working on this topic and bringing up papers on that, because I think the level of debate is not up to the importance of the question, because we only typically see this 2% of GDP or what it is, but we do not understand how crucial it is for the for essentially our mere existence in a sense. So thank you very much for joining. I'm very grateful for the panelists that took time for that, and hope to see you again in an energy event or fiscal event or maybe an agriculture event. Thanks a lot.
Thanks.